Well, much like the marketing for this event as promised, Rebecca and I are going to use our specialist knowledge and experience to guide you through some of the trials and tribulations of right sizing as we see it. So areas that we are planning to cover include reviewing the business, one size fits nobody, how to manage people out of the business whilst engaging the remaining staff, protecting your brand, maintaining productivity and performance, working with the relevant employment law, and managing right sizing through furlough. So we're using the term right sizing to mean making sure that the business has the optimum number of employees with the right skills and in the right roles to deliver its vision and objectives and achieve the business plan. So in an ideal world, businesses will be constantly reviewing performance and delivery and assessing the optimum resources required to deliver the optimum outcomes. This is achievable in organisations that are mature, have experienced leadership and managers, and operate in relatively stable markets. Businesses like these can use performance management and staff turnover as opportunities to achieve the right scale. Realistically though, and more usually, right sizing occurs periodically following some kind of business review or on realizing that performance has been disappointing or that there's been a significant market shift or anticipated market shifts. In short, ideally right sizing is a proactive activity, but frankly, usually it takes place more reactively. You'd have had to have been living like some kind of hermit separated from the rest of society not to realize that the world has been dramatically affected by the global novel coronavirus pandemic. Well, hang on a minute, isn't that how we've all lived for some months during lockdown? Businesses are wrestling with changing global dynamics, new operating procedures, and economic uncertainty. And there are a number of businesses who've benefited from the global pandemic. I'm sure they take no satisfaction in the context of their success, but equally, I'm sure from a business performance perspective that they're no less satisfied. For most businesses, if they haven't already done so, I would imagine business reviews to assess current circumstances and plan for the future are either underway or very much a current priority. I'm yet to find anybody who will guarantee what the new normal looks like. Many of us are starting to get a sense of what that might be, but even government and those closest to the science are struggling to balance what we would like with the reality of what we're facing. As we all know, countries around the world are changing their guidance on a regular basis, and our government continues to change its guidance and the laws according to the scientific evidence, assessment of impact on local areas, the people who live there, the economy, and the health and social services. The best advice I can give right now is work with the rules that we know and ensure that our operating procedures fit the bill, but have contingency plans ready to cope with further restrictions and also be ready to take advantage of loosening restrictions. I was once lucky enough to get a ride in a helicopter. As I was getting ready, the helicopter pilot handed me a helmet and said, "Here, one size fits nobody." And boy, was he right. That helmet caused me an hour of real discomfort, no, real pain, and certainly took the shine off the flight. Well, that and the simulated engine stall maneuver that the pilot insisted he demonstrate. The phrase "one size fits nobody" has stuck with me, and it's very relevant in the context of right sizing. Just because something works in one business doesn't mean to say it'll work in another. Right sizing for one may well be wrong sizing for another. Basically, performing an objective review for the specific circumstances facing a business is absolutely vital. A recent project I did for a client started with a desktop exercise informed only by dialogue with the chief executive and the finance director, and with some limited reports on business performance, costs, and structure. Important criteria for performing this type of review include pipeline of work, predictability of sales volumes, including competition and market dynamics, productivity and unit costs. Sometimes one simply has to understand what the business can afford and then cut one's cloth accordingly. In the project I was referring to a moment ago, initially the brief pre-lockdown was to improve accountability and ownership whilst delivering some efficiencies, but there was no specific target set for efficiencies. That did change after the pandemic hit Britain and lockdown was implemented. Savings and efficiencies became a higher priority. However, the initial objective analysis was done as a desktop exercise from the chief executive's perspective, based upon a desire in the first instance not to be overly influenced by views held within the business. Once completed, the objective desktop review was debated and discussed and tested by the leadership team. Of course, the downside of performing a desktop review is that you're unlikely to see the full picture.
Yeah, and Tom, I'll come in there, because my advice is to take a project team approach and definitely engage HR and ideally your legal team early, and don't leave HR wondering what's going on, because the HR team is not just operational. You know, they need to be involved at the strategic planning stage. And it's also important to plan so you can assess the legal and other risks before pressing go. You know, taking your helicopter phrase, one size fits nobody, is spot on. There are a number of different approaches that can be used to right size the business, you know, once you know what you're actually aiming to achieve. And I'm just going to run through some of those now. So, I mean, at the moment, the most likely thing that businesses are going to look at are redundancies, you know, but that might not be the only course of action. But with redundancies, there is a statutory definition. Essentially, you know, it's where there's a business closure or a workplace closure, or there's there's a need for less employees to do work of a particular kind. And the latter brings with that selection pool and objective selection criteria issues, you know, when we're considering a fair process, and I'm going to come on to that a little bit. Also, redundancy triggers an entitlement to statutory redundancy payments, but only if the redundant employee has at least 2 years service. We would also, if you look doing a review, look at, you know, a more wider restructure. And basically, you know, from a lawyer's perspective, this is where it's not a legally defined redundancy situation, but it often involves, you know, relatively minor changes to location, hours of work, duties, or other T's and C's. And you will need to inform and consult, as with redundancies, but you could avoid paying statutory redundancy payments. But do prepare for backlash, because I've had that before, when employees feel that the changes have been fundamentally changed. You know, we're saying, oh, we've tweaked it a little bit, but they're saying, no, it's fundamentally changed, and they argue that their role, you know, the requirements for the business to do their particular work has ceased and diminished, and that technically they're redundant, and they'll want their statutory redundancy payment. So you need to be careful. I talked earlier about planning. I put down there performance management. You may need to also go down the performance management route as part of the one size doesn't fit all. You know, is it really that you have the right number of people and the right roles, but they're just not the right people? You know, how many of those you're proposing to select for redundancy are already going through PIPs? You know, be careful, as they may allege that you're using redundancy or restructure labels as a cover story to short circuit the PIP. And the PIP might have led to their improved performance. So if there is a genuine performance issue, which needs to be addressed, you would be going through a longer process than perhaps a redundancy process. So you may find that this is used against you in any negotiations for an enhanced severance payment. What else could you consider? I mean, flexibility of the workforce. You know, I've put down on the slide agencies and 0 hours contracts, but you know, you've got to think about, is your business likely to pick up again? You know, could you, instead of making redundancies, reduce pay temporarily or permanently? Look at whether you can tweak with the benefits, reduce hours, introduce more flexibility. You know, people are now used to furlough. You know, would they be prepared to go on a sabbatical or take other short-term unpaid leave? And those sort of options will help you to retain talent, you know, and your company know-how, skills, and also save on recruitment costs and onboarding lag times if business picks up again. Another thing to look at maybe is, you know, does anyone want to take early retirement? There's been quite a lot about you know, those who are nearing, well, being forced into early retirement really, but, you know, there may be some who are willing to retire early. When I was talking about agency workers, you know, sometimes it's more economic to actually hire those workers directly, or, you know, or perhaps reduce their usage. So again, put them into the pot, as well as your other flexible contractors, etc. And if you are using agency workers, if you do need to collectively inform and consult, and I'll come on to that in a minute, you will need to tell the employee and trade union reps about your agency workers, because that's one of the bits of specific information. I put restrict recruitment. I mean, other people talk about freezing, but I think restrict is, you know, often more likely than total freeze, because there will be certain new roles that you might envisage part of right sizing. Withdraw job offers, you know, but do be careful, because it may be that they've already been accepted, and therefore you will need to give notice on that, because a contract would have already been created. Defer new joiners. Often in legal firms, this has happened in previous recessions, where new trainees have been asked for a small financial incentive to go and have a year off, basically, and come back and join later. More radically, should you be looking at insourcing? You thought it was a good idea to outsource the cleaning or the security services. Could you actually save money by bringing it back in-house? Could you do the reverse? Could you outsource it? And, you know, more radical than that, is there a part of your business that really doesn't fit and you could sell off that part, albeit there might not be a market at the moment? Obviously that brings in, from a legal perspective, 2P implications, and it will affect your project timetable. So it does add that kind of level of practical and legal complications, but I have seen that happen. And after we completed these slides, I actually read another article which was about maybe fast tracking re-employment for former employees. And it fits well with what we're going to go on to in a minute about employee engagement. You know, you may find yourself suddenly realizing you wish you hadn't let go of someone. So perhaps say, look, if it does pick up and you're still out of a job, you know, come back and see us. So that would be one thing. And then finally, I thought about secondment. It may be, and again, this is something the legal profession has done previously, it may be your clients might need those skills of the employee and be willing to sort of employ them direct on a secondment for a bit. So again, I think goes back to the point, put everything in the pot, because one size doesn't fit all, and it's going to be different businesses. So whatever route or routes you choose, do involve your staff as soon as possible. You know, they may have good ideas to save the business, and it will make them feel more valued.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I mean, speaking of involving your staff, I'm a big believer in this. The more people who feel they've been involved in the process, the more engaged they will feel in the outcomes. I mean, practically, it's not possible to involve everybody in the planning stages. Confidentiality and uncertainty are important factors. Many people find uncertainty difficult to deal with, and this can cause stress and anxiety. Confidentiality is therefore important until clear proposals and communication plans are ready. Where external advisors are involved, it's particularly important that openness and transparency exists with the leaders who will be responsible for the future success of the business. And a high degree of collaboration will lead to developing trust and build ownership of the proposals and the subsequent taking of responsibility for the outcomes that the business is looking for. In my latest project, having worked initially with the chief executive and the finance director, the next level of engagement was with the leadership team. And in addition, we used a small cross-section of key roles throughout the business in order to test assumptions and flush out potential obstacles, in addition to the previously mentioned benefits of engagement. For me, having built draft organization charts, a cost model, a matrix of key roles and responsibilities at the desktop stage, the engagement with the leadership and team members from the cross-section across the business really brought to life some of the real issues that we would face when consulting with the broader base of employees whose roles may be directly affected by the proposed changes. And this became really helpful in thinking about the process by which to affect the right sizing. in my PLC corporate years, where the number of employees affected might have been in the hundreds or thousands, there's obviously less opportunity for taking some of the slightly more pragmatic or flexible approaches. In this latest case, the number of redundancies was going to be less than 20. Rebecca, could you maybe give us an insight into a fair process?
Yeah, sure. Well, it depends really on what route you take. And because we've got certain time constraints, I'm going to assume that the right sizing is going to lead to redundancies and or restructuring involving changes to T's and C's. So that's the context I'm going to look at it at. First of all, you've got to consider whether you need to collectively inform and consult. And this is a numbers game. You're talking about the thousands and hundreds. Yeah, I've played that game because if you're proposing to make 20 or more employees redundant at one establishment, and you could play numbers games with establishments, but be careful because there's case law on that, and it might be a combination of sites are treated as one establishment. I think that's the Woolworths case. So it's 20 or more employees redundant within a 90-day period. And if that's the case, you'll need to inform and consult with trade union or employee representatives for 30 days before the first dismissal takes effect. Well, that's theoretical, but there are tactics which you can use to shorten it or streamline the process. But if you're proposing to make 100 or more employees redundant, that consultation period increases to 45 days. So if collective consultation is required, this will affect the overall project timeline. And also should bear in mind that in this context, redundant is wider than the definition of statutory redundancy payment, for statutory redundancy payment and unfair dismissal purposes. So it does encompass changes to T's and C's as part of a restructure. So just watch out for that. So you will need to elect employee reps if you don't recognise a trade union or if you don't have an elected employee representative body already. And remember that the sanction for failure to inform and consult is a protective award, and that's of up to 90 days gross actual pay for each affected employee. And it can add up to a substantial amount, because I've been involved in litigation where it's hundreds of thousands of pounds. In my experience, if trade unions are on the scene, they will certainly have a claim, they will certainly bring a claim if you don't involve them properly. And the COVID-19 situation will not be classed as a special circumstance to let you off the hook. So basically do whatever you can if collective information and consultation is triggered. You will have heard on the news recently about a number of proposed redundancies being notified to the government by large employers. And this is because you must notify the government at the outset if your proposal triggers collective information and consultation, and use what's called an HR1 form. Otherwise you face a criminal penalty. I have had one client many years ago who forgot to fill in the form and then did get a letter saying, you're criminally liable. Fortunately, it's not prison, but it is a fine of up to £5,000. So put it on the project timeline. And a fair process involves individual consultation, and for the smaller scale ones you're going to go straight for individual consultation. But even if there was collective consultation, you've then got to build in your individual consultation. Do start consultation as soon as possible. You don't want to be accused of presenting a fait accompli, so you need to be proposing something that can be discussed, or at least look like you're discussing it. Because the information and consultation process, particularly under collective rules, has to be meaningful. So what I would say that is that you have to listen and you have to consider the suggestions. You don't have to accept them, you can reject them, but have a good business rationale for doing so. Now, there's no mandatory statutory process for fairly dismissing an employee, but you need to check first of all that you haven't got a company policy or procedure lurking around in the back of the handbook, and also check that there isn't an implied process through customer practice, because you may find that certain employees say that, oh, we've always been paid X, Y, and Z as an enhanced redundancy payment. So just double check that. But if there's nothing else around, we do have guidance from case law as to what is fair and reasonable. And this is really what you need to do to minimise or avoid a risk of an unfair dismissal claim. We've talked about warning and consulting employees or their reps, adopting a fair basis to select. So that's in relation to the pool. So I always have lots of conversations about who to put in the pool and what objective criteria you should be using to select. And also don't forget to consider suitable alternative employment. You know, if you can offer suitable alternative employment, there will be a 4-week statutory trial period. So again, you need to think about that in terms of the timeline. If you're proposing to make changes to T's and C's, as I've said, you will need to either collectively and or individually consult, unless they're really, really minor changes. And the aim really is to get an agreed variation, failing which, you know, you're going to have to warn the employee that they're going to face dismissal. Now, in these times, the new normal is likely to be that many more consultation meetings are going to happen on Zoom or Teams or whatever. So be mindful of how this might affect the delivery of the message. Also, the availability of companions, because usually if you're going into a consultation meeting, you would say, you know, if you want, you can have a companion with you. And also privacy and distractions, because we're all working from home, we've got lots of distractions. Alternatively, you know, if a lot more people are returning to the office now, you know, make sure if you're having meetings in person, make sure it's COVID secure, etc. If redundancy notice is given, just remember that the employee has a right to reasonable time off during working hours to look for another job or arrange training. I'm conscious that a lot of those who are being made redundant at the moment are actually on furlough already, so that might not matter in practice, but that is what the law says. So right. Tom, I think it's over to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I mean, as I said, in my latest project, because there were less than 20 people going to be made redundant, we were able to individually consult with all of those affected. We were also able to undertake some pre-selection, thus reducing the number of people we actually placed at risk. And this leads me on to issues around minimising the impact and protecting your brand. And for me, minimising the impact means placing as few people as possible at risk of redundancy. Now, your HR manager or your legal advisor may give you very prudent, risk-averse, non-commercial advice, present company accept,
yeah.
Which keeps you very clearly safe from an employment law perspective. However, understanding the risks and taking a holistic view, which includes commercial imperatives alongside employee well-being and respect, and particularly the engagement of those who have a long-term future in the organisation. So when I talk about pre-selection and reducing the numbers of people placed at risk, what I'm talking about is only placing those people who have been pre-selected for redundancy at risk, rather than sometimes the whole pool of employees who might otherwise have been considered at risk. There can be really big benefits of not putting people who you want to keep at risk and minimising the number of people who can be disengaged by being placed at risk, and the possibility that this makes them feel, you know, unvalued, or the understandable reaction of registering with recruitment agencies just in case the worst happens. The more people placed at risk, the more danger that negative conversations about your business are taking place in the market. Have you got thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, definitely make the experience as human and painless as possible for affected employees, but also the managers who are having to deliver messages, and the survivors. We'll come on to them again later. And it should minimise the gossip and the Glassdoor or Facebook effect. You know, if you've got trade unions or elected reps, engage with them. If the consultation process is conducted effectively, it can boost employee engagement and protect your brand. And those employees who are not currently adversely affected by the right sizing see that their colleagues are being treated fairly, because they probably will be thinking that they might be next. And you just said about they might go and register with recruitment agents. They're more likely to commit to the business rather than look for another job. And also carrying out a fair process can minimise the likelihood of tribunal claims. And remember, I mean, it might take a long time for them to get to tribunal at the moment, given the backlog, but remember that there is a public register of claims and the hearings are in public, so that would affect your brand. Also have a proactive PR campaign, both internal and external. You know, try and tell the story with a positive spin about the future direction of the business. Tom, you talked about shortcuts. Yeah, that's fine, but we do need to plan them carefully. Otherwise, it might turn out more costly. You know, shortcuts often involve pre-termination protected conversations, i.e. they're off the record. And it's where a settlement is offered on more favourable terms than if the employee went through the redundancy process. So effectively, the employee has been pre-selected, which is risky, but the employee, you know, they've taken a calculated risk, basically, because the employer will need and know that they'll be able to persuade the employee that their selection is inevitable. So, you know, what we do is a lot of planning behind the scenes, just to double check that that's not going to be too risky. One tactic also is to see if there are any employees in the selection pool who have less than 2 years service. Because if they've got less than 2 years service, they're not going to have statutory redundancy entitlement, and they're not going to have unfair dismissal protection. So they could be pre-selected as lower risk, lower cost options. However, do tread carefully, as you may find that you've selected someone with a protected characteristic. So, you know, they might be on maternity leave and so have a right to be offered, you know, suitable available vacancy first. So again, it's about planning. Also, you may find that there are staff who will be willing to volunteer for redundancy. So that could be a shortcut. You might get the numbers you need. You know, for example, long servers who are nearing retirement. However, make sure that you reserve the right not to accept the application. And what I have found is that this really only works where the business is making mass redundancies, and they don't really care where the cost savings are made or who leaves. Otherwise, you're just hoping that the right person volunteers.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thanks, Rebecca. I mean, one big advantage of having an external consultant engaged in a right sizing process is that they can perform some, if not all, of the consultation process and leave the leadership and management of the business to focus on engaging with their employees and focusing on the pastoral side of line management, and also focusing employees on day-to-day issues and the future. This is an approach that I recently adopted when, as an external operating partner, I performed all of the individual consultations by Microsoft Teams, incidentally. Initially, some of the affected employees asked the question, you know, why is my line manager not here, not doing this? You know, I explained that I'd been involved in the whole review and was likely to be able to answer all or any questions that they had. But I think more importantly, ensure that consistency existed throughout all consultations, rather than having various line managers involved having different conversations with their different groups. And this was generally accepted. And whilst I was able to be, you know, clearly sensitive and respectful and supportive in my approach, I was also able to retain a level of objectivity and avoid anything emotive that might exist between an employee and their line manager. That's not to say that the line manager-employee relationship is not important. It is. The line manager must be fully briefed on the employer's plans and messaging so that they can answer any questions once the employee has left the meeting and reflected. You don't want line managers having their own agendas, you know, often the protection of their team, undermining the plan or causing confusion through misinformation. In parallel, you know, chief executive and leadership team maintained ongoing and regular employee briefings, which acknowledged and was sensitive to those impacted, but also focused on the positive outcomes in the future. In the current circumstances, it can be as much about returning to productivity as maintaining it. You know, part of my recent right-sizing project was able to integrate the consultation for redundancy with the return, or not, from furlough. I was able to use technology to consult with people in their homes, and the business was able to use the coronavirus job retention scheme to employees who were not made redundant whilst government support was still in place, and so that notice periods did not negatively impact on the company. Rebecca, what's the latest on furlough and redundancy?
Well, it's ending on the 31st of October. So employers are currently assessing what this means for their businesses and the future of their employees. Employers can make those who are on furlough redundant, HMRC has clarified that, you know, and that employers can still claim in respect of all aspects of the employee's notice pay. However, you shouldn't make the fact that an employee has been furloughed part of the selection criteria, you know, so especially if there are others who have been carrying out the same role who weren't furloughed. So that's in relation to selection. However, before you press go on redundancies, just think, could you effectively use the flexi furlough? You know, I bring some employees back part-time. It's not much longer now, though, I appreciate, so it could simply be delaying the inevitable. So in terms of notice pay, there's been quite a lot of toing and froing here. There was a concern that employers could not use furlough pay if an employee was continuing to work under notice. However, the Treasury did confirm on the 8th of July that that was acceptable. Then there was confusion over whether this was just for statutory minimum notice. However, on the 17th of July, they said, okay, employers, you can use the furlough pay for both statutory and any longer contractual notice pay. And that's the approach I think, Tom, you said you took. So, but most recently, on the 30th of July, the government said that as of the 31st of July, employers must be paid their normal wages, not the reduced amount of furlough or flexi furlough pay for their statutory notice pay and for statutory redundancy pay. And it's not retrospective. So if you have staff currently working out their notice period, it will only apply for the period on or after the 31st of July. So you don't have to go back and top it up. And the new regulations do not apply to the calculation of contractual notice pay over and above the statutory notice pay. Therefore, it is arguable that the position of employees who are entitled to at least 1 week more than statutory notice remain, they're basically, their notice pay could still be at the reduced rate, which seems a bit unfair, and it's unlikely that this is what the government intended. So we may see some backtracking again on that. So basically the situation now is that those employees on statutory minimum notice, with them, employees will need to top up the furlough pay to 100%. And with those who have more than statutory minimum notice, the employer could just pay the furlough rate for the whole of the notice period. However, as I say, that seems a bit unfair. And at the very least, I think that employees should get 100% for the statutory minimum notice and 80% for the balance. I'm assisting an employer at the moment, and we've just decided together that actually we're going to pay 100% for the whole of the month's contractual notice, rather than doing a kind of a hybrid, especially as the government is still picking up, you know, a lot of the tab for that notice period. And so we're just going to get some brownie points. We'll say, this is what the law says, but we're giving you a little bit more. Essentially, you need to consider the timing of the announcements of redundancies and when you're going to give notice of redundancy. Otherwise, you're going to end up paying the full amount of notice out of your own funds and not be able to offset some of that cost with furlough payments. Also, note that if you or your clients, because I know we've got some consultants, are used to paying in lieu of notice, you can still do that, but you cannot use the monies from the job retention scheme. And this is because the purpose of the furlough pay is to help the employer to continue to employ the employees. So that pylons are quite an unattractive option at the moment. So what's happening is most employers who are now making redundancies of those who are on furlough are basically saying stay on furlough and effectively work out, in inverted commas, their notice whilst they're on furlough, rather than paying in lieu of notice. So who pays the statutory redundancy payment? Well, it's not covered by the job retention scheme for furloughed staff. Therefore, employers will need to calculate the cost and budget for that. And also, in light of the government's 30th of July announcement, employers must use the employee's normal week's pay. Obviously, that's subject to the current week's pay cap of 538. So really, it's only going to affect those who are lower paid. However, if an employee is entitled to an enhanced redundancy pay, you know, I was talking about some employers have a formula that enhances, the employer can use the lower furlough pay figure for that element. So what we're seeing is a little bit of flexibility if employers are really, really strapped for cash. Now, in terms of unfair dismissal, can you make someone redundant rather than keeping on furlough? Because some people will say, oh, keep us on furlough. Well, the Employment Tribunal, if we got that far, would apply a test of reasonableness, and they would look at all the circumstances of the case, including the size and the resources of the employer. Now, since the 1st of August, an employer has been required to make a financial contribution towards the employee's furlough pay, and that's going to increase from the 1st of September and from the 1st of October. Therefore, the increasing cost to the employer of keeping the employee on furlough is relevant to answer that question, especially if redundancies are inevitable once the job retention scheme ends. So yes, it's likely to be fair to be able to make someone redundant now rather than waiting until the end of the furlough. Could you hold off redundancies until the 30th of January? You will have heard in the news that the government has introduced a new job retention bonus with the aim of encouraging firms to keep on furlough workers. It's a one-off payment of £1,000 for each furloughed employee who remains continuously employed through to the end of January. And this initiative has been widely criticised as giving monies to businesses that don't actually need it. Whereas critics say it would be better to extend the job retention scheme beyond the 31st of October. And they've talked about maybe doing that just for hard hit sectors. However, I think it's unlikely given the billions we've already spent as a nation. But, watch this space. Anything could happen. Now, I mentioned the word survivor earlier. You've worked hard to right-size your business. The redundant employees have now left the business, and hopefully positively, and you're ready to face the future with the survivors. Tom, your turn. How can the business keep them engaged and back up to optimum productivity and remain right-sized?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is more along the theme of areas that we've already covered. I think effective communications, frankly, is really important. Continue to use as many communication channels as possible to inform remaining staff what's going on and more importantly, what the future looks like. In my latest project, we used the opportunity to refresh all job descriptions in the new structure and clarify all the deliverables and performance metrics. We also refreshed all the meeting structures and associated reports. Having engaged leaders and managers communicating effectively with their teams, supplemented by periodic updates from chief executive or managing director is really very effective. I think training and development for the survivors, I think, that they may not have remained unscathed by the right sizing. Whilst not dismissed, their roles may have changed. So they may feel uncertain about their skills and experience and worried that they will face future performance management or redundancy. So ensuring that they're well supported by giving them relevant training and development and implementing mental health and wellbeing strategies. Now, don't set them up to fail, otherwise they will disengage quickly and look around. We implemented specific time periods to review and follow up some of the more significant changes. And we also ensured that all line managers sat and discussed the revised job descriptions with every member of staff and specifically asked them about training needs. Strategic incentives, I think, considering whether your existing remuneration and benefits package is fit for purpose in the new structure or the right-sized organisation, it's likely that bonus targets that were set at the beginning of 2020 are not achievable in the current climate. What's going to be more realistic and what's going to help to retain the talent to deliver, new and revised outcomes. And then performance management. I mean, if any underperformers have survived the redundancy cull, make sure that they're actively managed so as to improve their productivity. I think for me, those are certainly the main points about engaging survivors. So really that brings us almost to the end of what we wanted to cover today. And so there are just a few takeaways to finish up on here. I think first and foremost, I mean, obviously having heard from both Rebecca and myself, who kind of I guess make a living out of being outside organisations and being trusted advisors, offering support to multiple businesses. I think it's really important to consider: does your business have the capacity and or capability to perform an effective right sizing alongside the day job? And for some organizations that will be an easy answer. They've got the infrastructure to make changes themselves, and for others, having that extra support will be really beneficial. I think undertaking a thorough and objective review, like we discussed, I think is absolutely vital. That's the one size fits nobody answer to the question. Testing the analysis with key staff, ideally having a project team, ensuring leaders own the proposals. I think having people who've got to deliver outcomes afterwards, feeling quite strongly about the new right sizing shape and solutions being the right thing for them and their teams is important. Considering the most suitable approach for your business, is it a pure redundancy exercise, or is it a restructure, or a combination of both, or is it more about performance management, as we've discussed? Following a fair process, I think Rebecca's given us a lot of insight on how we do that. Respecting the casualties and supporting the survivors, the communication and respect and care by which these processes is followed is really important. Using the CJRS to benefit employees and the company. I don't think businesses should be embarrassed about leveraging the benefits that have been put there for the current purposes, and clearly there are benefits to both employees and businesses, and they should be used. Communicate. I don't want to sound too much like Tony Blair, but repeating things 3 times I think sometimes gets the message across. And last but not least, I think following up the transition period to ensure the process has been effective is really important. So before we get on to a quick Q&A session, I just wanted to take the opportunity to share a new service that's being offered by gunnercooke. As you've seen today, with presenters representing the operating partners within gunnercooke and the lawyers within gunnercooke, we do have a diverse mix of skills across the business, and we're now, along with the more traditional non-executive director offering, we're providing access to a tailored mix of skills from across gunnercooke based upon the needs of your business as an integrated service. So if there's anyone who thinks this may be of interest to them, please contact me afterwards. I just want to thank Helen for supporting, hosting and publicising this webinar, and obviously Rebecca for her great contribution. And we'll hand back to Helen to host any Q&A.